This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, an international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. To join our global community and access member-only webinars, events, a wide range of digital learning offerings, coaching and leadership resources, accreditation schemes, and more, you can find us at associationforcoaching.com. Hello and welcome to the podcast series from the Association for Coaching, Coaching in the Climate Crisis. My name is George Warren and I'm your host for this series, and today I'm delighted to be joined by an author, coach and trainer for resilience, wellbeing and active hope. And his name is Chris Johnstone. Chris, a warm welcome to you. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be having this conversation, George.
Thank you, Chris. Would you like to maybe tell our listeners a bit about the work that you're doing at the moment?
So my core interest is really around what helps people face difficult situations and respond in ways that make better versions of what happens next more likely. And I've been doing that for over 3 decades. My background was in medicine and I worked in the addictions recovery field for many years, but also specialising in the psychology of behaviour change. I got very interested in coaching for wellbeing. And so that's been a enduring interest, something I've been involved in for a long time too. And I lived in Bristol and I worked with the specialist addictions treatment agencies there and was also very involved in training. And then my wife grew up in the north of Scotland and we migrated to the north of Scotland about 10 years ago. And being a lot more trees up here than people, I developed online training, and online training is really my main work. I set up an online college at collegeofwellbeing.com. I've done several webinar series for the Association for Coaching, one in resilience and another in motivational interviewing. And the bulk of my work now is reaching people from more than 60 countries around the world through online training courses really around the psychology of resilience, what helps us support well-being, and also the psychology of sustainability, what helps us face concerns about the world and respond in ways where we actively support the future we hope for.
Thanks for sharing. And there's so much I resonate there, and I'm smiling and feeling good in my body. And I've got so many questions. So I guess what would be really helpful to start would be, in your studies of resilience and studies of the psychology of well-being and hope, what are some of the key learnings or epiphanies or pieces of advice that you'd like to share?
Well, one, it kind of sounds obvious in a way, but it's just recognizing that whatever you face, it can work out different ways. And people might say, well, that's hardly startling, but actually when things are really difficult, it can be hard to hang on to that. Joanna Macy, a friend, colleague, co-author of my book, Active Hope, she calls it radical uncertainty, that sense of just having openness to there's such a range of different ways it can go. And in the Penn Resilience Program, one of the strongest evidence-based resilience training programs in the world, they ask these 3 questions. They say, what's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? And also, what's most likely to happen? And what I like about those 3 views, and I have an image I call the spider diagram, where you see a spider on its side with lots of different legs. It's a kind of expanded version of those 3 questions, where the body of the spider is the present moment, and each leg represents a different way it can go. And so, for example, in the pandemic, you can say, what's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? What's most likely to happen? But also that idea, what's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? What's most likely to happen? What's really important there is that your starting point is informed by current reality. And so, for example, someone like Trump, when he was president, back in March last year, he was saying that he hoped to have full churches at Easter that was only a few weeks away. And that idea, what's the best that can happen? He was hoping for him the best that could happen would be churches full at Easter. But actually, in terms of COVID, that would be about the worst thing that could happen. And so this idea of recognizing that reality can work out different ways, but also the importance of starting from where we are and taking in evidence and reality-based view of where that is. I don't know how that sounds to you, George.
Well, it sounds, apart from talking about Trump, it sounds really good to me. And it really sits with my own personal philosophy of, which I believe I inherited from reading from the Stoics, the idea that even if we're at rock bottom, or what we feel is rock bottom, that there are options and choices ahead of us. And that it can be a question of, okay, identifying those and then looking as you said, what's the best case scenario here? What's the worst case scenario here? And what choices do I have in front of me?
And what's so important there is that your starting point is based on where you are. There's that lovely saying, in order to get to where you want to go, you need to start from where you are. And I think of my work in the addictions field over many years, and this thing about hopes as well, that sometimes I would be with clients who'd, if I was to explore with them what their hopes were, one of the hopes might be that they could carry on drinking. One person said, I love drinking. It's kind of, to me, it's the solution rather than the problem. This is somebody who'd really struggled with anxiety, but found that alcohol relieved their anxiety. And so this idea of, what are you hoping for? But that was also a hope not really based on recognizing that actually alcohol was a short-term fix, but actually made their anxiety worse. And it's that thing about, where is your starting point? Is your starting point based on a kind of illusion, or is your starting point based on, you use that term, hitting rock bottom? Hitting rock bottom is kind of descending until you hit something a bit firmer. I'm thinking of this, there's three different threads that I'm following here. So one is, we've mentioned COVID and COVID last year, and how important it is to have hopes based on reality. And that often involves letting go of things that you might have hoped for before. So, for example, you could say, well, I hope to have all my family round, for a meal. But actually, at a time when COVID was really spreading, there were certain hopes that we just had to relinquish, because there was something we hoped for even more than having people round for a meal, which was our relatives being well and we being well. And so this question about hope, I think there's what you might hope for on the surface, but there's also the sense of, what do you really hope for? What do you really hope for? So with the COVID, we had to let go of some of the more, perhaps less deeply held hopes in order to preserve the deeper hopes. So that's with COVID. And a similar thing is true with my work in addictions recovery, that somebody might say, I hope to have a drink. But when you kind of explore the question, what do you really hope for? What's deeply important to you? There might be things like protecting important relationships. There might be things like, certainly in the case of the person I referred to, for him, what was deeply important was actually staving off his anxiety. He had been tormented by anxiety and saw alcohol as a protector. But in fact, it was like the problem went, but it came back with interest. And when we were able to work together on seeing that, he was able to let go of some of the attachment to alcohol, because he saw it as more of a problem than a solution. So as I said, there were three things I was tracking. One was about COVID, one was about alcohol, but also the conversation is part of a series looking at coaching and climate change. And there's very similar things there. There's, what do I hope for? And what do I really hope for? So, for example, somebody might hope to go on holiday somewhere exotic, but actually their hopes for their children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, for family members and younger family members, their hopes for them outweigh their hopes for the foreign holiday. And this is the difficult kind of weighing up that we're being confronted with in these times. What do I hope for on the surface, but there's also what do I really hope for? And sometimes what I really hope for is threatened by some of the things that might seem like more superficial hopes.
Yeah, it's such a valuable point that you've raised there, and across all three threads. And what I'm especially interested in as a coach and a climate conscious coach as well is it the coach's role to offer that connection between taking a flight on holiday and then the future generations? Or if I mention that, will that put the person into defensiveness, or will they feel threatened or criticized? Or is it something maybe more traditional coaching would say, well, you must work to the person you're speaking with, your client's agenda, and it's not for us to offer links between that and that, or that connections between flying and future generations' safety?
Such brilliant questions, George. And also, this is what we're grappling with. And I think one of the core questions here is, what's the story that I want to happen through me? And we're going to come back to that. What's the story that I want to happen through me? And what I would say is I work with what I call the me, you and us model of well-being. And you can apply this, to things like dealing with stress. You can apply it to resilience and burnout. So me is about self-care. And I love the phrase you used, George, a climate conscious coach. So if you're a climate conscious coach, as in a coach who's also conscious of the climate chaos, climate emergency we're facing, one of the questions you might have is, well, how do I deal with my own anxieties here? How do I deal with my own sense of contradictions of sometimes my role might seem to be propping up a system that's causing the harm? And there's all kinds of discrepancies. Discrepancies is where what we're doing feels out of kilter with what we feel we should be doing. And it's this thing about, what do I hope for? I hope to have a life that makes sense to me, where I feel that I'm living in alignment with my value. I hope for a successful business. I hope for satisfied clients. But what do I really hope for? And not somehow complicit with a system that I know is causing harm. So this is the me side. So then comes the you side, where I think we do have professional responsibilities. You is where I'm helping somebody in front of me. And this question of, what's my role here? What's my role? Is it my role to interrogate people about their holiday plans? I would say no. We're not here as the climate police. But am I here to help my clients tap into their deeper hopes? I think most coaches would say, yes, that's my role. That's what I do. That I help people tap into their more intrinsic motivations, the things that really give their life meaning, that if they're going to have success, just think of the book 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, Stephen Covey. He says that it's possible to be highly successful, but in the wrong direction. And that part of coaching is about helping people recognize what's the right direction for them. That's where, certainly for me, I make it quite clear that I help people work with some of the challenges of our times. And so the kind of clients I get in my coaching work, which is a fairly small part of my work, but it's part of my work, coaching, because my main work is as an educator, and so I keep my coaching client list fairly small, but it's something that I've been involved in a long time and I love to do and deeply believe in the value of coaching. I think it's such a useful thing to do that people come to me saying, I want to live, the phrase I use is a beautiful life. A beautiful life is one that's good for me and also good for the world. Working with those contradictions of how do I both make a living and make a difference, or finding ways of weaving them more closely together. So if we flag that up as that's the kind of work we do, then clients will self-select. But if we find that somebody has different values to us, then and there, you have a climate conscious coach and maybe a climate less conscious client. I'd think my role is to be a good servant to them and their journey of well-being. And I suppose it's kind of looking at, well, back to this thing, what's the story that happens through me? And what is it I'm supporting? So I'm sort of hovering here because I'm aware that there's tension between different things here. That there's one hand, if I'm a performance coach, I want to help people perform well. But also, if somebody has concerns and they come up in a coaching session, how do I respond? And I think this is where some of the work is to be done, because I have people tell me that they've raised the issue of their concerns about the world with coaches and therapists and found that it's been somehow closed down as an area of conversation. And I think that if we're looking at being 21st century coaches, which we are, living in this century, we need to think, what does 21st century coaching look like? And are we supporting a version of reality that is harming not just future generations, but also the people we work with? I come back to this question, what happens through me? And I just want to come on to I talked about me, you and us. So let's come on to us. So us is where in our coaching work, there might be shared concerns that we have with our clients. That, for example, a shared concern we might have with our clients, most coaches know what it's like to feel under stress. And a shared concern they might have with their clients is tackling stress. And they might support their clients with those. And so there's a way in which there's a me side, the coach looking after their own stress, the you side supporting someone else with their stress, but there's also an us side where we might be alongside our coaches together facing an issue and saying, hey, what can we do about this? And that we're there more as allies in a shared purpose rather than somehow people who are supporting just someone else with something that's just their concern.
Something of the collaborative nature.
Exactly that. That, for example, I do a lot of work around well-being, and sometimes I work with people who have responsibilities not only for their own well-being, but other people's well-being too. They might be people who play leading roles in well-being in an organisation. And the idea of playing a part in cultural shifts in how we think about stress and resilience and well-being in organisations is something where I feel like I'm moving from just me or just you to also an us. It's like we're sharing a larger purpose. And this is something I've given decades of my life to. So it's something I have lots to say, but also I'm there more as an ally. And sometimes there's this I have different hats. Sometimes I'm more as a coach and sometimes I'm more as a mentor. And I'm sure that's a role that's very familiar to many people here. Sometimes they're more as a coach, sometimes they're more as a mentor. And so it's like, how do we upskill ourselves in both coaching and mentoring when the topic of concerns about the world we face come up? And just for example, I was reading just this morning research. It was a big survey, Ipsos Mori, one of those big Mori polls where they asked over 18,000 people in 24 countries whether they felt the world was getting better or worse. And 67% of people thought the world was getting worse. 13% of people thought the world was getting better. Now, if somebody has that kind of anxiety going on somewhere in their mind and heart, I'd hope that it's something that was seen as a legitimate concern to bring up in coaching. But I just wonder how often that happens. I wonder how many clients and coaches are both feeling alone with their concerns about the world because they've become taboo topics to have conversations about.
Thanks, Chris. The thing The added complexity I wanted to offer is that let's look at business or executive coaching or performance coaching. Often there's a third party, a stakeholder, the business often paying for the coaching. So for me, that adds an extra complexity that the coach or the coachee might not feel it's appropriate to be talking about, let's say, the climate crisis, because the business might be paying for it. It might not be specifically on point to the topic for the coaching.
Yes. So I think one of the things to say is, what hat am I wearing? And what is the contract that I have? But also, it's interesting to think about third-party involvement, because actually a lot of organisations are saying very clearly that they have, for example, corporate responsibility policies, that one of the threats to an organisation is reputation. And particularly where there's for example, disinvestment programs for people who are behind the times on climate change or who are active contributors to the problem, there is a sense of getting on board larger agendas. So I think one of the things is a common phrase is this the idea of the VUCA realities, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, is that the rules can be changing. And that if you're in a time where you're not talking about real issues that threaten an organisation, so for example, COVID's a really good example. It's something that's very big on a landscape, has huge implications. And you might think, well, actually, that's not in my brief given by an organisation to talk about COVID, because the brief was written in an age before COVID. But that wouldn't stop you talking about it, because you can see it's deeply relevant. And where 67% of people look at the world and think things are getting worse, where there are, just what's happening in Germany this week, over 40 people have died from floods, what we've been seeing in Canada and the States with the heat waves there. I've been in touch with somebody who lives near the little town in Canada that was not known for excessive temperatures, but it's basically burnt to the ground because of the temperature recorded was over 48 degrees centigrade, linked to the heat wave, the rise in wildfires. That to not have conversational space to talk about real issues of this time has the real danger of actually blocking leaders' capacity to address the issues facing them. And so if our role is, particularly in executive coaching, is to have support conversational space for leadership, leadership needs to have eyes open and space to talk about and work with the challenges facing them. The thread I wanted to pick up, George, was come back to this question, what happens through you? And in our book that I co-wrote with Joanna Macy, American, amazing, inspirational figure, she's 92 now, and we talk about 3 ways of looking at our world situation, and we talk about them as 3 stories, and I think of them more as vantage points. It's what do you look from? And you can look at our world from a story of business as usual. And the core assumption in business as usual is things aren't too bad. We can carry on our business the way we usually do. And if you look at what's going on through that story, you might think climate change isn't in the contract. We shouldn't talk about it. But there's another story which is based on recognition that things in many important indices in our world are falling apart, are declining, deteriorating, descending, are unravelling. And the term we use is the great unravelling. The great unravelling, we call it that because there's a larger pattern behind the many different expressions of disaster happening, that you can have floods in Germany at the same time as escalation of wildfires in Canada and the States and Australia and Siberia at the moment as well, huge areas burning. And to tie all these different disasters together to see the larger pattern, it's good to give it a name. And so the great unraveling is a name to what you see happening in the world when you look ahead in time and you see descent, you see decline, you see concern about deteriorating conditions. And climate, it's not all about climate change. Climate change is one aspect of a larger system dynamic called overshoot and collapse. And overshoot is where you extend too far for too long in a way that erodes the carrying capacity of might be an organisation or a person. And so one example of overshoot and collapse is where you overfarm a field of wheat, for example. If you overfarm and you deplete the topsoil, you end up in time with a desert. You get collapse of its fertility. The same thing happens in an individual with burnout. If they push too hard, it's like they undermine their carrying capacity, their ability to cope, hold themselves up under pressure. And you can get various types of collapse, whether it's a nervous breakdown or heart attack or accident. There's different ways you can get collapse of functional capacity. But the same thing's happening in our world. And so, for example, there's a thing they call World Overshoot Day, where if we think, how much time is needed for the earth to produce all the resources that are used up in a year? So if we use so much wood, how long will it take the world to grow the wood that we use up? And if that date is less than a year, so for example, in a year, if we use twice as much wood as is produced by the world in a year, then basically what we'll have is depleting the resource of wood. The amount of wood will get less and less each year. And what's been happening is that since about 1972, the World Overshoot Day has been getting earlier and earlier in the year, until last year, interestingly, that it just last year, we actually had a slight slowing down of the way that we're using up our world. And what this means is that the world is being used up in a way where every year there's a bit less left for future generations, a bit less in the capacity of our world to cope with rising carbon dioxide, a bit less ability to cope with rising toxin levels, a bit less in terms of the resources. And I think sometimes it's like we forget that we're completely dependent on life. For everything we eat, we're dependent on life for the oxygen we breathe. Yet what's happening is that we're living on a contracting net resource of ecosystems. So the great unraveling is where we're recognizing this overshoot and collapse. We're using up our world too much, too quickly, in a way where every year there's less available for future generations. But what can happen is if you push overshoot too far, you get collapse. And collapse is kind of breakdown. And it's interesting that young people in France and Britain, high proportion, expect a collapse of civilization in their lifetime. In the past, that might have been seen as a fringe view, but it's becoming more common. People are looking ahead and thinking, I'm not sure things are going to last. And even what's the point of working hard in a career if the world is going to fall apart in the time that I'm working? Even research that shows that high proportion of young people are deciding not to have children because they fear for the world they're going to be growing up in. The word that comes up for me as we're talking is heavy. We're getting heavy, and heaviness, heavy conversations are seen as kind of unwelcome. Unwelcome is like, Chris, why are you being so depressing? You're meant to be... I set up something in Bristol called the Bristol Happiness Lectures. I've been very interested in positive psychology for a long time. I was an early adopter of positive psychology in the UK. But I just want to acknowledge that what we're talking about right now is heavy.
Yeah, and it certainly... I think a lot of listeners could probably relate to the fact that depending on where you choose to learn about the world and get your news, these sorts of things can be coming your way every day, sometimes several times a day, as you've mentioned this week, this global catastrophes. And I think something that's not often talked about or not talked about enough is the fact that it can make a number of humans just shut down and ignore it or kick the can down the road or bring in gallows humor. Oh, we're all messed up or we're hopeless. And so my question is, where does the role of active hope come in helping us deal with all this heavy, heavy, heavy news that's coming our way daily?
So I like the idea of 3 stories. And the first story is business as usual. And if we look at the world from business as usual, we might want to minimize the bad news. We might want to turn away from it. We might want to say, oh, that's not too bad. Then there's the story of the great unraveling, which really is a horror story. And when you live in that story, when you look at the future and it just feels so horribly depressing, it feels like a kind of emotional, dangerous area. And it can lead, as you say, people to looking for escape routes. And one of the features of this kind of mindset is a risk of suicide, a risk of increase of junking out. People think, what's the point? What's the point of going on? And I remember this is exactly what I worked with when I was working in addictions recovery, where people's lives had become so bleak that they were difficult to look at, and alcohol was used as a escape route. It's like, this is too painful, I don't want to look. And that's what leads to what I think of as masking rock bottom. Masking rock bottom is where we can see the crash, but it's too painful to look at, so we turn away. We find ways of spray painting over it. So masking rock bottom delays recovery. But what helps recovery is hitting rock bottom. And hitting rock bottom is where there's a moment in people's addictions recovery where the full horror kind of causes such alarm that people make a deep-seated decision to change. And people familiar with that concept of hitting rock bottom. And that can lead some people to think that, well, perhaps we just need to wait till things get really, really awful and then people will change. But that's not what I've seen happen. I think what can happen is when things get worse, sometimes people can find it even more difficult to acknowledge what's going on. It can go either way. That people can hit rock bottom, they can also mask rock bottom. But in my work in addictions recovery, one of the things I learned that was so helpful was this idea of raising rock bottom, which is about strengthening people's capacity to feel shaken and stirred before the crash. If people can feel shaken and stirred before the crash, if they can see where we're going and think, this really horrifies me, in a way where they become activated, it can lead to a turning. And so the third story, which I love and feel deeply rooted in, I think of as the great turning. And this I learnt about from my work with Joanna Macy, but it's really also the same story or very similar story to what I was working with in addictions recovery. And I think the thing about recovery is there's different directions of change. There's what you're recovering from, but there's also what you're recovering towards. And we might have different things we're recovering from. For some people, it might be addiction. For some people, it might be depression. I'd say for all of us, we need to look at how do we recover from the degree of overshoot which is leading to collapse. And I think that also what I'm struck by is that 10 or 20 years ago, recovery might have seemed more doable. But it actually looks now that we are so far advanced in the unraveling process, just in terms of difficult changes that have already been set in motion, that it's not so much as simple as recovery. It's more about how do we... This is where the word resilience, resilience is about when you face something difficult, how do you make a better version of what comes next be more likely? And so this idea of the great turning, I think of it as a turning away from destructive approaches to life, a turning towards an approach that is life-sustaining. But to have either of those turning away from or turning towards, the one thing you need before either of those is just turning up with a desire to play our part. And so I think that if we want to have more meaningful lives in these times, more connected lives where we feel a stronger sense of belonging to life, being part of life, it's like, how do we face the horror of what we see and then have a response that we feel good about? And that can lead to what I call afterglow. Afterglow is the warm feeling of satisfaction when you've done something you feel good about. And it's very important for our psychological well-being. It's this thing about how do we live a life that we actually have our heart in, where we can feel at the end of the day, I feel good about what I did today. And so then it comes to you ask the question, well, where does active hope come into this? Because when I talk about the great turning, sometimes people say to me things like, well, Chris, it all sounds very nice, but I can't see it happening. People are too stuck in their ways. And what I do as a reply is I say, well, if we move from outcome is will it happen or won't it happen, to process. And process is, well, what makes it more likely to happen? If we were to look at the micro steps of it happening, what would it look like in this moment right now? If the great turning was to happen in you and in me and in everyone listening, or anyone listening in their own ways, what would that be like? And I'd say, well, as I said, the starting point is turning up. I'm turning up with an intention to play my part. And so that then comes to this question, well, what about coaches? And how could coaches, people with coaching experience and coaching skills, turn up in a way that's useful in these times? And so I come back to this question, what happens through us? And I wonder, what would it be like if the story of the great turning happened through us as a profession? The larger story of people turning up to offer something useful and meaningful in these times. What would that be from coaches? Certainly people in the fire service, they're going to be very busy with all the wildfires. There's like 2,000 people fighting fires in Siberia at the moment. Emergency services, they're going to be working really hard. But actually, there's something here about what they call upstream interventions. So upstream interventions, if you imagine that, for example, lots of people are out at sea and they need to be picked up by rescue boats, that's a downstream intervention, picking people up in the rescue boats. But if you ask the question, how come people are falling into the water? And you were to go upstream and see maybe there's a pathway that's very slippery and people are sliding from there off some cliff into the sea, that would be an example of an upstream intervention. And so what's an upstream intervention with climate change? It's really to do with our whole view of reality, our whole view of what we're here for, our whole view of progress. And coaches are very good at helping people think outside the box, at helping people revisit their core priorities and say, is this what I really want? It's like that thing about being highly effective, but in the wrong direction. What are the directions that we want to be effective in these times? And so if coaches and people with coaching skills were to turn up well in this time, they may be helping people revisit some of the decisions that are steering us further into this mess, rather than just firefighting when things really get more difficult.
I resonate very strongly with what you're saying. And I'm reminded of, what we spoke about earlier in the conversation, but that sense of 20 years ago or so, Blakey and Day spoke about in their challenging coaching work about coaches in collusion with their clients. So it was mutually beneficial. The coaches get paid and the coaches help. I think they talked about the bankers. They helped the bankers earn more money, and it was helping them both seemingly, but not helping society, and arguably contributed to collapse. So there's something I really feel very strongly in what you're saying about coaching, bringing in something of a conscience into the conversation as well, and helping clients and even the sponsors find their ideal path and the one that works for everyone.
Exactly that. And I think this is where well-being is a really good example of this, because there has been a time where to talk about well-being was almost seen as disloyal, that somehow the goal was to get on with the task. And I've been involved in running stress management courses for decades, and there's almost a sense that what I was teaching people to do, for example, the value of pauses and breaks and recovery time, might be seen as taking people away from their task. And there's been a shift. There's been a shift in management thinking that actually somebody being loyal to an organisation also involves being loyal to their own well-being. Because if employees aren't loyal to their own well-being, the cost in terms of staff sickness levels, staff turnover, staff morale become unacceptably high for an organisation. And so just to talk about performance without looking at what supports performance, i.e. well-being, it's one of the most important predictors of performance at work is how people are, how they feel in themselves. So it's actually seen as greater loyalty to include well-being. Even if it leads to short-term costs, it can create longer-term benefits. And what we're really looking at here with climate change is a similar shift where we're extending what I call the timescape. The timescape is the period of time we give our attention to, that flogging our guts out and becoming burnt out and exhausted isn't good for an organisation, but also destroying the world we live in. I mean, it is a complete nonsense how it can... and so one of the questions might be, well, how long would you like an organisation to flourish for? Are you only interested in flourishing in the next 6 months, or would you like an organisation to still be flourishing in 20 years' time? It's a great question to ask of families. You kind of think, well, how long would you like your family to live for? How long would you like your organisation to live for? How long would you like your team to keep functioning well for? And this is a cultural shift that supports well-being, because we're looking not just at this short-term gain, but at long-term expense, which is exactly what you have in addictions recovery. It's what you had with Bernard Madoff. He made off with huge amounts of money, but actually was sent to prison because he was defrauding people. And in a way, I kind of feel like the economic system has a danger of behaving like Bernard Madoff on a much larger level, if it only focuses on very short-term benefits, but a longer-term cost that we all pay. I want to throw in something, George, because my role as an online educator is developing resources that help us tackle these issues. And I've set up an online course, which is free, called the Active Hope Foundation's Training. And the core of it are practices. There are 7 practices, a series of 7 practices you can learn over 7 weeks. So you do a different practice every week. But you can do these practices by yourself. So it could just be the me side of self-care. And they're about really what helps us face disturbing information and respond in a way where we feel nourished and energized and inspired, looking at what supports that. And what I also really like about these practices is they work really well as paired work practices, partner practices. And I think this is a coaching competence we need to develop. It's about how do I get better at having conversations about some of this difficult, heavy stuff. In these series of practices, one of the first is about just reminding ourselves what we love and appreciate, like giving attention to gratitude. When we give attention to what we're grateful for, who we're grateful to, we actually remind ourselves why it's worth turning up to play a role in protecting life. that if our life is really unsatisfying, you kind of think, well, what's the point of looking after it? But it's like, but gratitude is also nourishing, and research shows that it's also strengthening of resilience, that if we pay attention to resourcing ourselves by giving attention to what we appreciate and who we're grateful for, we remind ourselves also of the network of support that resources us, that we can draw from. But then to look at what we find disturbing or difficult. So this idea of what Joanna Macy called honouring our pain for the world. And honouring is really about recognising the value in something. That just as you need to have alarm bells when things go off course, and in the financial scandal, the collapse of 2008, I wonder what would have happened if coaching support had helped people acknowledge their own alarm bells at what they saw going on in a way that might have allowed earlier recognition of the way that some financial organisations were going so dangerously off course. So honouring our pain, pain alerts us. It can be a life-preserving signal. But then once we see that, it's very common for people to feel powerless, to feel like, well, what can I do anyway? And that's where this third stage is about seeing with new eyes. It's about looking for encouraging perspectives, nourishing perspectives that give us a greater sense of possibility. And there are so many of those. Really, that's been a big part of my life work, is looking at how perspectives can empower and inspire. Particularly, I'm very interested in systems thinking and Gaia theory, but there's also so much around the psychology of breakthroughs that's useful too. But then the fourth stage is around going forth. It's about what's my role, what's my part. So this 4-stage journey is the framework for this 7-week course that I've developed, and which is just available for free at activehope.training is the website.
Thank you for the mention, and you've touched on one of the things I most admire about you and the work you're doing, is that you take and have taken this whole career of, well, being a medical doctor, coach, trainer, systems thinking, Gaia theory, big, complex stuff, and it's beautifully distilled into programs such as this, and images and metaphors, which are really easily understood, and crucially, they're easily communicated on. And I think I just love how much resource there is from you for coaches and people who coach and people who don't coach out there to make a positive change and to have more courageous and more inspiring conversations.
Thank you, George.
Chris, I've got a couple of questions I'm holding. You touched on positive psychology there, and I wanted to ask your thoughts on what role you see positive psychology playing in the future of humanity. Let's go big.
Yes, it's so interesting because Martin Seligman, very much one of the grandparents of positive psychology, key pioneer who I've learned so much from. He says there's been a shift in positive psychology from happyology to a focus more on flourishing. But also one of the big contributions of positive psychology has been in resilience training. And particularly I've learned so much from that Penn resilience program. And one of the things Martin Seligman says, he said it in a footnote in his book, Authentic Happiness, is that positive psychology is different from positive thinking. It's not just looking at the bright side. It's about having an optimal balance between positive and negative. So, for example, the example he gives is if a pilot is getting low on fuel, you don't just want them to have wishful thinking of la, it will all be fine. You want them to have a real awareness of the unraveling that would happen if they didn't pay enough attention to that. And I like the idea of positive psychology. There's different sides. One is about positive experience, but another is about positive functioning. And it's a great question. What is positive functioning in a building that's on fire? One of the most important things, it's about noticing the building is on fire. But then it's saying, okay, difficult beginning, how can it have a better ending or a better version of what comes next? And that is about being activated to respond. And I ran a course years ago at Schumacher College called Positive Psychology for the Planet, and really looking at how we can draw on the findings of positive psychology about helping us find our best selves in a way that can strengthen our capacity to play our best part in these times. And that's still something I'm very much committed to. I run a course every year, the Positive Psychology Foundations, with my colleague Miriam Akhtar. And we're very clear in that we work with this me, you and us model, that it's looking at how we have a better version of our own lives. But one of the key elements of a better version of our own lives is meaningfulness, is where we feel that our life makes a meaningful contribution to something bigger than ourselves. And you could say, what time could there be that's more meaningful than a time where life on Earth is literally under threat? There's a mass extinction event underway. Species are becoming extinct at a much, much higher rate than the background level. And previous mass extinction events have been things like mass volcanic eruptions and huge asteroids crashing into the Earth. But what's crashing into Earth at the moment is it's not just humans, it's what we might think of as an industrial growth society that believes that progress is measured on how much we grow, even if that growth is measured in how much forests we're tearing down and how much pollution we're creating. It's really, when we look at this question, what is it we really want? So much of what are seen as measures of progress are actually being highly effective at taking us the wrong way.
And what would you like to see the coaching industry, and you mentioned as well the therapeutic industry, what would you like to see those industries do in order to help us get out of this industrial way of thinking?
Well, I think one of the biggest shifts comes down to this question, what story happens through you? And in a way, I think we're living at a teachable moment in time. A teachable moment is where there's a insight that it can be more clearly seen because of what's happened. So, for example, if somebody's just had a heart attack and they're a heavy smoker, it might be a teachable moment to talk about smoking. They might have much greater motivation to tackle their smoking, and people who give up smoking after a heart attack are less likely to have another one. So they can influence what happens next. And I think with the pandemic, one of the dynamics that got played out was between business as usual and unraveling. So this idea, business as usual, we can carry on our business the way we usually do. When people did that, it's like the more they did that, the more the pandemic led to unraveling. And so there's something here about a lesson between the sequence that starts with a hazard, that becomes a harm, that becomes a disaster, that could become a catastrophe. If my hope, I guess, for the coaching industry, as it is with individuals, it's like saying we've got a choice of what story we put ourselves behind. Do we put ourselves behind the story of business as usual, even if we have a sense that it's taking us downhill, it's taking us over the edge of a cliff? I don't think the story of the great unraveling is something we so much choose as just find ourselves in. But what I like is this idea that recovery is a direction we can move in from any starting point. And even if we think things have gone hopelessly wrong, it's like saying, well, what's the direction I want things to move in? And that involves a turning process, a turning away from the harmful trajectory, a turning towards a healthier trajectory. And so my hope for coaches are good at helping people open up conversational space where they can look at their lives and reevaluate and recalibrate their directions, their goals, their priorities. And that's needed. That's needed in these times. And so I think I totally get the issue of we're not here to push people in directions that they haven't signed up for. It's more about when people do raise concerns, are we open to exploring that ground with them? Have we explored it ourselves? How do we develop the competencies of being a 21st century coach, where there's me, you and us. There's me, which is about how do I look after my own well-being and deal with my own concerns in these times and play a meaningful life. How do I help others do that? But how do I also move beyond just a very individualistic approach where I see people in little boxes by themselves rather than people as part of larger systems where an important dimension of their well-being is their sense of meaningfulness and belonging. And also important for all of our survival is how we act together when facing a shared sense of threat. We've seen that with the pandemic. It's been a teachable moment. We've had to completely reinvent our sense of how we go about things in so many ways. And I think one of the big lessons of the pandemic has actually been how incredibly well we've been able to do that. There's so many things. If people had said 2 years ago, there will be a time where people stop using cars in cities and the air becomes cleaner and people stop flying. Admittedly, it's only been temporarily so far, but people 2 years ago said, oh, that will never happen. You know, people are so set in their ways, they'll never change. But they have changed when they've had that sense of recognition of the need for change. And it's more like, well, we're confronted with confusing realities, painful realities. Coaches are good at helping people face difficult stuff and rise to the occasion. That's what's needed in these times.
Thanks, Chris. As we start to draw the conversation to a close, you mentioned the 7-week course, activehope.training. I'm wondering if there's any other resources you'd like to offer to listeners who want to follow more of your work or indeed to stay connected with you or follow you. What would you like to say to them?
Yes, thank you. So I have a range of different types of work, and broadly it's about making a difference. So the Active Hope work, activehope.training, but there's also about well-being and resilience. So I set up an online college called collegeofwellbeing.com. I run a resilience practitioner training every year as a live webinar-based course from October to January, and it's available the rest of the year as a recorded course. I've also got 2 other online resilience courses. One of them is free. It's called Resilience Tools for Free in a Time of Coronavirus Crisis, and there's a website, resiliencetraining.net. You can just go to there or collegeofwellbeing.com and you can see the free course. But I've also got a 3-hour video-based course called 7 Ways to Build Resilience based on my book of the same title. It costs about £30 and some organisations have bought it for their staff as well. So there's bulk discounts for larger numbers of people. And it talks you through 7 areas of practice that support our building of resilience. And I would say that resilience, if we're facing this unraveling process in the world, we need to upskill in our resilience literacy. And so that's a big part of my work. So I check out my books, Active Hope with Joanna Macy, but also 7 Ways to Build Resilience, but also the courses that I've got linked to both those books and both of those areas of work.
Thanks, Chris. And the last question I wanted to ask was, what inspires you and keeps you motivated?
Yes. And also I've got a question for you if you've got room for it. So I'll pick up the question, what inspires me? So I love life, you know, and one of the practices I do, it's called the 42 plus. And it's actually one of the practices on the Active Hope course. So 42 plus is like 3 dimensions of gratitude. There's first is, what am I grateful for? And if you just have a sentence that starts with the words, I love ... and you just talk for a minute, I love ... You know, there's so much I love. I love being alive. I love music. I love where I live. I love Kirsty, my wife. I love our dogs. I love growing fruits. I love the beauty of nature. I love the possibility of what we could become. I think humans are capable of so many beautiful sides. We've also got horrendous potential too of all the ghastly things that can happen through us. But we've also got an ability to choose what we cultivate and help grow and develop. And I think of this as evolution, really. It's like evolution is something that happens through us. And so what I love and inspires me is, I guess, this thing about active hope. What do I hope we will become as a species? And how can I be active in making that more likely? How can I be active in putting myself behind that hope? So that's the I love. But then there's also the 42 plus. So 4 is what I'm grateful for. 2 is who I'm grateful to. And I just have the beginning sentence, I'd like to thank. And when I think of all the people and entities I'd like to thank, I just am so aware that I'm part of a larger flow of giving and receiving, that I've received so much. I've received so much in the way of really good teaching from people who've inspired me, Joanna Macy being one of them, but also all the people who played a role in my coaching, learning journey, all the clients I've worked with, but also I'm really grateful to Kirsty, my wife. And when I feel part of this network of giving and receiving and aware of the people I want to thank, then the plus is, what can I add as a way of expressing my gratitude? What can I add? This idea of some people you can pay them back, but some people they're not around anymore, and it's more about how we pay forward. If I've received from life, how can I give back to life? And I love this idea of paying it forward. How can I, acknowledging what I've received and what I love, how can I give something to that? And I love this term, the gift of active hope. The gift of active hope is, what's my contribution? What's my offering to the process of supporting the version of the future I hope for? Because it can go so many different ways. Right at the beginning, saying, what's a useful idea? It's just acknowledging the future can go so many different ways. But I'm clear which way I hope for, and I want to give something to the process of making that more likely. And so this idea of, what's my gift of active hope? How can I offer something? Like every day I can offer something, maybe something small, showing up, turning up. Then I have larger projects. Some of them are multi-year projects that are larger offerings, whether they're books or online courses or attention to a fruit garden, or participation in a community. So that's what inspires me. But what I wanted to ask you, George, is what's landing in you from the conversation we've been having? I really appreciate your provocative and evocative questions. You've been really skilled at drawing out from me some of the things that I find helpful. What's landing with you? What are you taking away? What do you find useful here?
Well, thanks for asking, Chris. The thing that I think, because of the recency, the thing that resonates physically, I can feel it in my chest, is that sense of deep gratitude and how powerful that can be. Bringing in a sense of gratitude has helped me live a much more fulfilled and happy life. And I talk about gratitude a lot to my friends and clients and beyond, because for me that's been a key to a happier, more purposeful life. I'm smiling hearing your approach there. I love it. And it's something I'm looking forward to trying myself. But truly, and in the spirit of gratitude, it's all landed for me. And I like to go away and take my dog for a walk and let the coffee brew and let it percolate. And I'm looking forward to listening to this back again, because I imagine it's a conversation I'll go back to more than once. Because, as I said, I really feel that one of your great skills is taking these big and, to many, very scary emotional topics, but helping us as a species reframe them and learn from them and use them for our own benefit and our own growth and our own survival as well. So, I'm going to be looking up some of your resilience training courses as well after this, because I'm just fascinated to learn more.
I'd love to work with you.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, good. And I think this is one of our offerings of the coaching community. We're interested in, skilled in, experienced in helping people face difficult situations and responding in a way that makes the version of what happens next be a better one. And that's what's needed in our times.
Chris, what would you like to say to our listeners by way of closing today?
Well, I want to say thank you, actually, for turning up. And, you know, there's so many other things that you could have done. But if you've given your attention to this, recognise that that's the great turning happening through you. You've turned up. You've turned up to take part in a conversation. And my encouragement is to also to explore that question, what's landing in me? What do I find useful? I think it's one of the ways that we deepen our harvesting of any learning or training experience is afterwards just asking ourselves, you know, what's landed in me here? What's useful? What am I taking away? Because that way we help it land and become implanted in a way that it's likely to have more value. But also that we see this as a us thing. You know, an us thing is that we're having a conversation, and sometimes we don't know what the best response is until we hear ourselves and other people talking about it. And that's really what coaching is based on, that conversations are helpful in supporting us to address and move forward with difficult challenges. And that's what's needed in our times.
Chris, thank you so much for today. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you and go to those places with you. Thank you. This podcast was brought to you by the Association for Coaching. Discover more business coaching resources, thought leadership, and online learning at associationforcoaching.com.